Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and today I'm thrilled to be talking about Good One, a show about jokes. We are joined today by Eddie Schmidt, who's the showrunner, executive producer, and director on the series, along with Jason Carden, who's an executive producer. And what I love about this kind of like docu-special is that we get to kind of follow Mike Birbiglia at a point where we don't usually get an insight into comedians, where he's coming off the back of a really successful run of a show and saying, I don't know what the next show is going to be about yet. And it feels like it's such a vulnerable space for him to allow us into as an audience. And so what were the early conversations with him and really kind of creating this series around a very open and vulnerable point in his career?
Well, I think we were always looking for a pivot point, right? I think a comedian, as you say, about to do something next, right? Whatever it is, I'm about to do my new hour, I'm about to host an award show, I'm about to do something I haven't done. That was exciting to us because I think we felt like, well, that's a way to get in on the ground floor and, you know, really see how the comedy sausage gets made. So,
yeah, and we had an advantage because the show is based on an existing podcast, Vulture's podcast, Good One, and Mike has been a guest on that show a few times, so he very quickly understood what we were trying to do and understood the visual element that we were trying to add to it, so that helped.
And it's also an interesting aspect in terms of creating the show because you also don't know where the story is going to go during that time as well. And so what was that experience of creating something and kind of discovering the journey along the way as much as he was discovering his next material?
Well, I think that's what you hope for in documentary, right? That you don't know where you're going. You have a plan, you have an idea, but you don't really know. And I think what drew us in here was we knew that he was going to sort of kick off this phase doing these shows very close to where he grew up. So we thought, okay, well, that's going to be a way that we can see process and personal come together as he shapes this material.
And I'll say that this is an area that Eddie is very comfortable with, and I was scared to death the whole time because I don't know where it's going, and I usually do. So it was nice to have him to say, it's all right, we're going to get there, we're going to get something good, and we did.
Yeah.
Well, and it's sort of the sweet spot that you hope for when you make things like this that are in this documentary space, because you want something combustible to happen. You want something that you didn't expect, but you have to sort of create the parameters and the comfort for that to happen. I think, you know, we were really grateful that Mike put so much trust in us and was so willing to open the door. He posted a comment online that was something like, I gave this documentary far too much access, and as a result, it's very good.
Yeah.
I mean, it's also interesting because he's doing these very small and intimate gigs, and you know, there's always that space for comedians of doing these shows where it's not about it being filmed, it's not about it being sent out to a wider audience because you're really workshopping the material. And so how was that experience in terms of him allowing you that access to film and essentially broadcast shows that usually we would never see?
It was an ongoing conversation.
It was an ongoing conversation. I think that there was a certain level of, you're protective of that part of the process. Comedians are, but they also see the value in exploring it, talking about it with others, and kind of exposing it a little bit. Specifically, Mike Birbiglia, his process is very specific, and it's something that he has kind of passed down to other comedians, and so I think he had some experience with exposing it to you know, outside of his realm, and this was just a larger version of that.
Yeah, it's like he loves craft, and that's sort of known about him, and so I think that gave him a comfort with being able to kind of expose that. But also, I think he knew, like, we were interested in the pieces of his material that came from a personal place. So it seemed sort of very clear avenues of like, oh, okay, we're interested in where you're gonna go with this material, what it's gonna become. And so the connective points between the jokes and the things in his life were clear, I think.
There's also an art in kind of creating this piece where we're kind of jumping in and out of his shows, and you don't have the gift of the audience sitting and watching a full 1 hour special, but we still understand the material and kind of like what these shows are looking like by the clips that you're taking and the context clues that you're giving us along the way. So was that kind of an ongoing process of, you know, oh, this works, this makes sense as a standalone, but if we edit it a little bit differently, maybe it shifts how the audience are going to perceive this?
One thing that we talked about a lot, specifically in the edit, in the post-production of it, was how often you're repeating jokes. So because, you know, it's an exploration of a joke. So in a special, you get it one time, it's very curated, and that's it. And this was, you know, there are slight changes from show to show. There are things that work and don't, and so there was a lot of discussion on how much to show that, how to show it differently, and then when to kind of lean into the changes. And that, I think, is like one of the special aspects of it, is that you get to see a joke evolve.
Well, and I looked at it too, kind of like a music documentary in a way, where, in a music documentary, a good one, the songs are story. They're advancing the story. And so I think when we were putting this together here, we thought, oh, this is really interesting as you're sort of going on this journey with him. This joke advances the story. And so that was really helpful to us, and I think, made for a really nice, cohesive whole.
I also love there's kind of like a meta moment where he's recording his podcast with Ira Glass, and he's talking about filming this at the same time on camera while you're filming him. And I just love the inclusion of that. Was that something that you had any sense that he was going to start talking about, or was it just very in the moment?
It wasn't. I mean, we knew we wanted Ira in the show. We knew that they were going to tape, and we knew they had a close relationship. What we didn't know, obviously, was that we would turn the cameras on when they were setting up. So I didn't know he would acknowledge us, but I think that really was nice, and as you say, added an interesting element. And also there's a vulnerability to it that I think is really nice.
Especially because of their relationship. I think that
Right.
Ira knows him very well. They've had these types of discussion. He knows his family.
Right.
And so he was able to get to something very specific in Mike that I don't think very many people could have, and especially in that moment.
I would agree. I think Ira started talking, and I was, checking off my mental checklist. Oh, he asked about that. We got that. Oh, great.
You're like, you're hired.
Yeah.
You mentioned at the beginning, obviously we see him like going to his hometown, and even just having him sit down on camera with his brother, and the two of them talk about working together as well, just gives us this whole other sense that we've heard him tell these stories, but to kind of see it in practice is something really different. And so how did you set about kind of opening up those spaces for the audience?
Well, again, I think because Good One came from the podcast, there was already this template. It's an interview show in the podcast, but when we were adapting it, we always thought, well, that's providing, there's an arc to the way that Jesse David Fox does the podcast interviews. We thought we're going to translate that arc into an immersive documentary experience. And so it was kind of like, we felt like we were sort of answering the questions of, where does a comedian's material come from? That was sort of the thrust of it. And so that's what we were kind of looking for.
And because you kind of had that foundation for how those conversations happen for Good One, how did that set about the way that you wanted to have Mike interviewed and talking to camera for the talking head moments?
Well, I think, it's interesting because I've made a lot of documentary pieces, and so oftentimes, you sort of do like an entrance interview and an exit interview. So you do something at the top of filming that helps you find where story points are, and then you do something later that helps you kind of tie in the story points that you've found. And so we did that here. He did sort of two main interviews. So we were able to obviously draw on Jesse David Fox's skill, as a podcast interviewer, but we also were very conscious of what we were getting in the documentary portions to drive what we were asking.
For example, there's a moment in the special where you go to the house that he grew up in, and originally we were supposed to be outside of the house, and that was all we had planned to get. And then the new owners came out, they recognized Mike, they brought us in, and we got so much material on the fly that ended up informing a lot of things, and especially that exit interview talking about it put him in this nostalgic kind of looking at his life and looking at how his work is impacted by that. And that all kind of happened because the opportunity came and Eddie jumped on it.
Well, and it's funny because, since it was spontaneous, like we had no way to prearrange or even pre-light. Mike just said, hey, is it okay if we go in here? And I said, sure, because, he comes from a yes and school of comedy, and I come from a yes and school of documentary making. And I think by going with him on that, and I thought, well, this is going to be great wherever it goes, because he wants to do it. And I think that also, it was the very first thing we shot on the very first day, and I think that built a lot of trust, because he thought, okay, so if I want to explore something, you'll go with me. And it was like, of course we will,
And that level of trust that's so clear in the way that he is revealing himself in this is so wonderful, because one of my favorite things in terms of any documentary thing that's looking at creative process is when you really get to see a window into it. And again, it's a different thing to hear him talking about that, but to see him sitting there with his note cards and being like, if if I take this joke out, even though it's a good joke, if I take it out and the show still works, then it doesn't need to be in there. And seeing him sit there and read from his journals and literally reading something that he wrote as a child about some 4-year-old stuffing grass in his nose. And so did you have a sense of what he was going to share with you and what he was going to show you to begin with? And
well, I'll say, which was, Good One is a special. We hope that we can do more with other comedians because we think that it's very translatable. And so we felt that in adapting from a podcast, we wanted things that were visual and tactile. So having the process part, in other words, I didn't know going in, does he use audio recordings? How does he write? Okay, so he journals. So that was very important to see him journaling and his journals, but what we were going to see in them, we didn't know until we actually showed up and he opened them up.
I think that an important thing in the very, very beginning, when we first started developing this and having conversations about it, the most important thing was to create an environment where the subject felt safe, that it was the comedy experience that we have, the documentary experience that Eddie has, that we would create an environment where it was collaborative and safe and a place where they could reveal those types of things. And Mike felt it immediately, and then that's, a lot of that stuff came from that as well.
And you mentioned before that, Mike's very open about his process with other comedians, and I think you bring in some really interesting voices to talk about the way that it's influenced them, and even just having Seth Meyers on camera be like, I used to type things out, but now I handwrite them, because if you write something down, the amount of time it takes to do that is longer, so you really know if it's a good joke or not. And so when you were looking at the other people that you wanted to include and the voices that you wanted on camera, was it important to you to have people that could speak to the impact of Mike's creative process on them?
It was very important that we have comedians that could really speak to his process and influence, because that gave them an authentic peer relationship, as opposed to, say, like a critic or something. It's like they understand the work that goes in, and I think one of the reasons that we were so excited to partner with Jason and Seth and Mike Shoemaker on this was because Seth really appreciates comedy. I mean, he's labeled the appreciator in this, because he has such a generous spirit about comedy, and so that made him, sort of a natural person to get behind this, but also to speak on camera about Mike.
He is first and foremost a fan of comedy. If you watch his show, if you listen to any interview with him, he's always talking about other people and how their process and what they're doing and why it excites him. And I think that also translates to Atsuko and Hasan as well. They both have direct influence from Mike in their work. And so kind of similarly, they could speak, very well to his process and how to influence them.
And you've also kind of taken this piece, and it's specifically following Mike Birbiglia, but then you kind of draw the lens back in terms of comedy as a whole, the impact that each generation has on the next generation of comedians, the different creative approaches that everybody uses. And so how did you set about creating something that's very specific, but also allows for that much broader conversation about comedy as well?
I think, in thinking about how to adapt the Good One podcast, we were really looking at those sort of touchstones, and in the interviews that Jesse does in the podcast, there is this trajectory of like the comic is the result of what came before them, and they're going to influence what comes after them. And so we thought, okay, we really want to get specific with that and visual with it, and I think that's what we were trying to do.
It is a small community, and everyone does it, whether they know it or not. You influence each other, and you're influenced by things that you respect, and you hopefully are influencing the next generation. So it's a big part of it.
And in terms of the post-production, anytime you're filming anything documentary-based, there's always that process in post-production of you kind of have to kill your darlings to a certain extent because of just the amount of footage that you're filming versus the time that you have on screen. So what were some of those moments in this? Because it kind of feels like you could film, and every single moment that you get would be something that could be great.
Yes, I mean, I think that we did capture a lot of things that were wonderful, and so it became clear, I think, from the direction that Mike's material was taking and the shape of it, sort of where the story should go. So there were other interesting moments that we captured, some of which were similar to what we had, and some were maybe a little bit different or had to do with other aspects of being on the road. But it just became clear what was necessary, I think, in this story.
And my job was to beg to put things back in. Because there were things that I loved that would get cut, and then we would put them back in, and sometimes they would convince me it has to go, and I would say, okay, but...
Yeah, I mean, it's important that things breathe too. So I think we felt like we want to have. There's some moments that are sort of fast-paced, and then there's some moments that you sort of live in, right? And if you want to have that breadth, then it does mean that sometimes something that's just wonderful on its own doesn't fit within the whole. And you go, well, I guess we can't include this.
Yeah.
But I was happy that you convinced me to put something like that.
And in kind of getting to make this whole piece and really talk about craft and creative process and what that means to different artists, do you feel like it's kind of influenced or changed the way that you think about your own approach to craft and creative process?
That's a great question. I think it has changed only because it's, I guess, made me conscious of the sort of points along the way, and I've had to sort of maybe analyze my own process in a way that I probably wouldn't have, you know.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that like my absolute favorite part of what we do is the process, is putting things together, is kind of seeing it come to fruition. And this just kind of put a finer point on that. It makes you kind of recognize that more.
Right. So now we're incredibly self-conscious about how everything we do.
So it was all great.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
I really, really loved this, and you mentioned that you hope that you get to kind of do more with other comedians in the future, and I hope that as an audience member that we get to see that. But congratulations on an amazing special. It's really, really fantastic, and thank you so much.
Thank you.